Our brains are question answering machines. That's how our brain interrogates the world all the time. And I do this experiment with people. I give them a random question and say, hey, take 30 seconds, just write down as many things that pop into your head. And they end up with lists of like 4 or 5 things. And it's because anytime you put a question to your brain begins to answer it. A lot of us do this the wrong way. We say things like, well, why am I so bad at this?
Rich Diviney.
Rich Diviney.
Rich Diviney.
A retired Navy SEAL commander.
And Rich was in charge of selection process and also human performance, understanding the attributes required to perform at that level, and then the teachings.
I would say emotion is interesting because emotion is fuel, but emotion also can sometimes take us out of that conscious thinking realm to a degree that we don't necessarily want. People sometimes say, hey, why is humor an attribute? And the reason is humor is a hack into feeling better. How do you assess someone's levels of adaptability or perseverance or things like that? All we need to know is if we're ignoring attributes in the performance picture, we're ignoring a huge part, if not the most important part of the performance picture. When we think about the attributes, we all have all of the attributes. The difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each. And so the idea is...
Hey, how are you?
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Pete.
Yeah, no, anytime. Honestly, I've just been spending the morning running around listening to you on various different podcasts and diving deep into your book. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invite. So,
I guess before we dive into the realities of the book, let's maybe start with who you are, what you do, and why.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Rich Diviney, and my background is of the U.S. military. So I went into the U.S. Navy in 1996. I grew up in Connecticut, New England, part of the U.S., and went into the Navy in 1996. Went straight to Navy SEAL training. Made it through Navy SEAL training, which is good, and then spent 21 years as a Navy SEAL. Obviously, after 2001, it got very kinetic with the wars and ended up with 13 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan and a couple more here and there. But also, as an officer, was in command of a SEAL team, ran selection and assessment for one of our specialized SEAL teams. And so did a lot of work and got really interested in performance and what drives and allows people to do what they do. So I retired in 2017 and went into the leadership space, began to really think about performance and wanting to write a book. Linked up with, met and became good friends with Andrew Hubermann, who you and I talk about, and he and I talked a lot about and did a lot of work in performance. And that kind of drove me to write the Attributes book. I wrote that and what came out in 2021. And since then have been working with businesses and teams and organizations around this whole concept of performance and attributes. And that's kind of what drives me. I currently live in Virginia, and I'm married 23 years to the same lovely woman, and we have 2 teenage boys, 19 and 17. So
the start obviously has to come back to 21 years in service and 13 overseas deployments. What drove you to want to pursue the SEALs, and what was the reality of Buds and Hell Week like?
Yeah, I mean, what drove me was this. I always wanted to be a Navy pilot. I wanted to fly, and I wanted to land on ships. And that was where I was driven until early 90s. I learned about the Navy SEALs. What's interesting is everybody knows about the Navy SEALs nowadays. Back then, very few people knew what the Navy SEAls were. There weren't a lot of books, TV shows, or movies about Navy SEAls. But I discovered them and realized, man, this is a group of people who really, they not only are they elite and they do cool stuff, but they also, their home base is the water and the ocean. And I love the ocean. I love being in the water. I thought that was really audacious to make the ocean your safe zone. And the fact that they are sea air, SEAL stands for sea, air, land. So they kind of did everything. So coming out of college, when I was given kind of at the point to choose which direction you want to go, I said to myself, well, I knew I could be a pilot, but I didn't want to always wonder if I could be a Navy SEAL. And that's kind of why I went. And fortunately I did. I did. And so Buds, again, Buds is a real kick in the teeth. I mean, you start, the selection process is 6 months long. There's a 90% attrition rate. And so my class, for example, started with 170 or so students, and we graduated 38. And that's normal numbers, and so going through that, it really was, you recognize that it's much more of a mental drill than it is a physical one. You obviously do very difficult physical things in SEAL training, but people don't generally quit because of the physical stuff. They quit because of the mental side. A lot of times because of the cold. It's just so cold, and they make you so cold and miserable and wet. And so what you learn is that it forges this confidence in you that you can really go through any situation and deal with any environment. And not only you, but those teammates around you. And I think that's the brilliance of the program. So yeah, going through that was certainly interesting. And then, of course, the first 5 years of my career were fairly slow. There was nothing going on. And of course, 9/11 happened. And then everything got pretty exciting after that, going to Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, yeah, that's an interesting profession. And it's interesting to live that life because it becomes normal for you. Most people, they can't imagine that being normal.
You mentioned nutrition rate, but in your experience, why do some candidates seemingly perfectly fit with the skill set fail within those environments, whilst others potentially less qualified or on paper they'd actually succeed?
Well, in a word, attributes, and I know we're going to get into it, but it's this idea that type of selection process, athleticism has nothing to do with it. Yes, you have to be in shape, right? But being an athlete, it has nothing to do with it. And a lot of times people come in thinking that being super physically fit and super athletic is going to be the key. But what they do in that SEAL training is they take you down to zero. I mean, almost on day one, you're down at zero. And they ask you, okay, now what do you have? Now what can you do? And so people don't recognize that, yeah, you can be a super athlete, but if you're not able to, from the point of zero, perform, you're not going to make it through. And that's all mental. I think it's that mental game. It's the ability to really drive yourself and keep going when things are really, really bad and miserable. But not just like crawl through moaning and complaining, actually perform, actually do what you need to do. So there's a difference. I mean, people get put in tough situations and they can just kind of muddle through and be zombies. But no, this is about actually making shit happen. And that's, I think, where you get the separation of those who can or can't. And again, I want to just emphasize, this is a specific niche inside of which some of us excel. You know, whether or not you make it through SEAL training has no measure on you as a human being, right? I mean, there are certain of us who are designed to be SEALs, you know, and then there's a lot who aren't. None of us in SEAL training look down upon those folks who quit. It's just, you know, okay, good on you for trying, and we're just going to move on. So people who don't make it through, there's nothing worse about them. They're just not particularly fit for that niche.
And what was it in respect to Hell Week, for example? Because obviously that's a week that breaks a lot of people.
I wish I could tell you. I mean, you forget a lot about Hell Week, you know, because you literally get up. I mean, again, for your audience that don't know, Hell Week is an evolution where you start on a Sunday afternoon and basically go from that Sunday afternoon until the following Friday. You sleep for maybe 2.5 hours the entire week, not every day, the entire week. And the whole time you're, you know, running around with heavy boats on your head. You're wet and sandy, cold, miserable. And so, I mean, I remember snippets of Hell Week, but as you get further in the week, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier. But that's one of those things that you really have to dig deep, and you can't overwhelm yourself with kind of the scope of the ask. In other words, the saying at Hell Week is, if you think about Friday on Monday, you're going to quit. So you really have to be diligent in your ability to just focus on one thing at a time and move through and make it happen.
Yeah. I've always been intrigued, and I've heard you talk on other podcasts as well, in respect to optimal versus peak performance. In my respect, I'm more attuned to optimal rather than peak, but yeah, I think our audience would be intrigued as to your insight in regards to that as well.
Oh, well, yeah, 100%. And I think the idea of performance, as I began to get really interested in studying performance, I wanted to figure out what we were talking about. When you say performance, it can be a specific word, it can be sometimes kind of an obtuse word. All I know is that there's always been this fad around or focus on peak performance. And even back in the SEAL teams, people used to say, you SEALs, you're the ultimate peak performers. And I disagreed with that statement. And the reason why I did is because peak, by definition, is an apex. And there's only one place you can go from an apex, and that's down, you know. And the other thing about peak performance, as you'll agree with because of the types of athletic endeavors that you do, is that peak performance almost always has to be planned for and scheduled for, right? I mean, the pro football player plans and schedules his entire week so that he can peak for 3 hours on game day, right? And we don't get to do that as SEALs. We don't get to do that as normal people. Even endurance athletes don't get to do that. We have to think about it differently. So optimal performance is, I'm going to do the best I can in the moment, whatever the best looks like in the moment. So sometimes our best in the moment looks like peak, and it's flow states and everything's clicking and everything's cool. But sometimes our best in the moment is you are just gutting it out, head down, going step by step, and it's dirty and it's gritty and it's ugly and it's hard. And so that is still performing optimally. Optimal performance allows us to kind of put this umbrella over the whole performance picture. And underneath this umbrella lives peak performance. It lives gutting it out. It lives recovery, right? All that. And it's really a modulation. It allows us to modulate. Because the other thing I say is it allows us to celebrate those times when we're not at peak, right? That's the cool thing about optimal performance. But also, more importantly, it allows us to do what I call energy modulation, right? In other words, I don't need to be peak when I'm driving to the grocery store. Okay. I could be at a different energy level. One of the myths I'll bust about Navy SEALs, people have seen it on TV or movies. They might see a group of SEALs getting ready to go into a mission and they all huddle up and they're hoo-yawing and they're high-fiving before they go on the mission. That never happens. Okay. It never does. In fact, most of the time we'd be in the helicopter on our way into combat and the guys around me would be asleep. They'd be napping. And there's a reason behind that. It's because we don't know what's coming. We don't know how long we're going to be out there. We don't know what's going to be required of us. We're not going to waste an ounce of energy doing things we don't need to do. And so we're very much aerobic thinkers. And I know because of the running you do, this idea is that we don't go all out if we don't need to go all out. I mean, we start at a pace and we're always pacing ourselves. And if we need to go all out at certain bursts, yeah, we do that, right? But then we'll pull it back. It's always a very precise modulation of what level of energy we're putting forth in the moment because we want to play the long game. And that's really what optimal performance is all about.
Yeah, the long game, definitely. To relate it to running, very rarely do you run anything above a 6 or a 7. You're keeping it at a lower tempo within a threshold, just to get that nice balance between endurance and stamina. And looking at the work that you do, obviously you've spent so many years within the SEALs, and we're going to dive into the 25 hidden drivers of attributes. In the field, what did you see as the primary ones, if you can touch upon them, and where possible, maybe walk through some stories that you've actually experienced that due to these attributes, due to these focus points that have enabled you to thrive in these really tough environments?
Yeah, well, so it's always unique to the environment, obviously. Every profession or group or team or organization has its own unique set of attributes that define what is required for that team. So in other words, the set of attributes that makes up a great SEAL team is going to look different than the set of attributes that makes up a great teaching team or surgical team or sales team. However, when it comes to SEALs, I would say, and I obviously can't talk about too many really missions, but I will say that when it comes to the job we do, one of the primary jobs we do is called close quarter combat or close quarter battle. That's really the act and art of running into buildings and clearing rooms until you either find your bad guy or rescue a hostage. And it's a very dynamic and fast-paced, moving, and dangerous evolution because you're literally running into rooms and addressing threats of people who are going to try to shoot you before they get to shoot you. In that process, what I recognize, some of the most important attributes for SEALs doing that are the mental acuity attributes, the ability to, and those, by the way, are situation awareness, compartmentalization, task switching, and learnability. And then we've added discernment because now we have 41 attributes. The idea that you run into a room, and as you run into a room, you are ultimately coming in kind of with a wide view so you can get a real quick picture of what you have. And then immediately you're moving into a compartmentalization phase where you're focusing in on, you're picking out what the threat is, you're focusing on the threat, you're addressing that threat. And as soon as you address that threat, you're now pulling back out and task switching to the next threat, right? You're going threat to threat and coming back out to situation awareness. So it's kind of it's the mental acuity, and it's very rapid. So the mental acuity attributes, it's kind of a wide in, and in a very rapid way. And some of the levels of close quarter combat, especially when you're talking about a hostage rescue, are so fast. The guys who couldn't keep up were the guys who didn't make it, right? They just couldn't grasp the speed with which you had to come in, process, address, come back out, and keep on moving. So I would say if there were some of the most important attributes for Navy SEALs, it was those. It was situation awareness, compartmentalization. You could probably make an argument for courage in terms of just what you have to do. But again, I would say courage, the reason why it could be an argument for courage is because courage is literally the ability to step into one's fear. And so your levels of fear are always going to be subjective to the individual. What causes my amygdala to kick off and my autonomic arousal goes up is going to be different than someone else's, which means there are certain things I was doing as a SEAL that I didn't need courage to do because I wasn't, like, for example, scuba diving. Like, I could literally be underwater, pitch black, sea life teeming around me, and I could fall asleep. I'm not nervous at all. Whereas for some people that would that would make them so frightened that they could barely breathe. So fear becomes subjective. But I would say courage is one of them just because you do have to go into some nasty areas and face bad guys who want to kill you. So those would be some of the most important ones, I think.
What about things like leadership? Because you're a commander within the SEALs. How does the premise of leadership evolve from a SEALs environment to the work that you do today?
So leadership is interesting. I think the way I talk about leadership today when I go into businesses and teams is I talk about a leadership model that really is reflective of what SEALs do and really the highest performing teams do. And people often think of leadership as, this top down thing where the leader sits on top and you have to bark orders and things like that. And that's kind of the pyramid model. That's not really how it works. And in fact, I would even say when you look at some of those models we've heard about, people have said, well, there's a flat model, and the flat model is where, no one outranks anybody. We're all in this together, just do this. That doesn't work either, because things get siloed or people don't know who's in charge. And then there is a model where the servant leadership model, where they flip the pyramid upside down. The leader sits on the bottom, which is nice philosophically, but it's still not accurate in terms of a high-performing team, because in a high-performing team, burden is distributed. It's not all on one person. So the leadership model that we use in the SEAL teams, and we talk about in the work I do, is really kind of, if you were to visualize, it's a blob, it's an amoeba. And inside that blob or an amoeba, the leader is wherever the leader needs to be in the moment. And we call this dynamic subordination. So dynamic subordination implies that a team understands that challenges and issues and problems can come from any angle at any moment. And when one does, the person who's closest to that problem and the most capable immediately steps up and takes lead. And then everybody follows, right? And then the environment shifts and someone else steps up and everybody follows. It's a dynamic swap between leader and follower. I also call it alpha hopping. That alpha position just hops to wherever it needs to be. And so when we talk about leadership in high-performing teams, or even specifically the SEAL teams, yes, I was the guy in charge because I was the officer in charge, but that did not mean that I was always in front leading. That really highly depended on the situation. Sometimes I was in back supporting because that's what the environment required. Sometimes I was in front, but you really set up an environment that allows for every team member to have a chance and an opportunity to step up when it's their opportunity to step up and when they're the best person to step up. That's how the highest performing teams operate. So the leadership attributes become important for everybody, because in a high performing team, everybody is going to have the opportunity to step up and lead. Now, in the classical sense, my job as the person in charge, right, and maybe of the highest rank, one of my jobs on that team is to create and make sure that environment exists. Okay, I need to make sure that the team is set up and understands that I am going to give them the opportunity to step up and lead when it's their turn. And I'm not going to get in their way. I'm going to support them and I'm going to guide them and I'm going to try to make sure that they're prepared to do that, because ultimately that's what you need to do. I need to have a team that operates independently sometimes of where I'm at. They may have a picture of a situation where they have to make decisions and I have no clue on what's going on, or at least not no clue, but not enough fidelity to actually make a decision. So they need to make the decision. That's, I think, how the best teams operate. And so I always talk about the dynamic subordination model working in any high-performing team in any domain. And you can do this in business, you can do this in athletics, you can do this in the military. But this is a high-performing team that dynamic subordinates. That could be a great marriage. I mean, my wife and I, again, I said we've been married 23 years. We are a high-performing team. We've been married 23 years. We lived through a war together. We've raised 2 kids. And honestly, we step up and step back. We're always modulating. Sometimes she's in the lead, sometimes I'm in the lead, right? But we're always mutually supporting each other. And it can happen with any team. And I think that's the most important model to focus on.
I was listening to a story that you were telling about your time during SEALs training as well, and the varied roles that's required within high-performing teams, such as the class clown, is quite important.
So humor is one of the attributes I talk about in the book. And people sometimes say, hey, why is humor an attribute? And the reason is because I've never experienced a high-performing team that doesn't have humor as a part of it. And there's a reason. And so the story I reference in the book goes back to SEAL training. So in Navy SEAL training, BUDS and basic SEAL training, it's in San Diego, California, Coronado. Now, anybody who has not been to Southern California, or I should say, let me reverse that. Anybody who has been to Southern California will agree with me when I say the water out there is not tropical at all. It's cold, right? A lot of people think of Southern California water as warm and tropical. It's not at all. It's cold. In fact, that's why most people quit, is because of the cold. But one of the things they make you do in SEAL training is an evolution called surf torture. And surf torture is an evolution where they have all the students line up on the edge of the surf zone and you all link arms. And then you walk out into the surf zone until it's about knee high. And then you turn around and you lay down. And so the waves are crashing over you and then they're receding and they're crashing over. It's called surf torture. It's one of the coldest things certainly I've ever experienced, because the water's cold when it hits you, then it recedes and the wind hits you and you get water up your nose. It's awful. Get a lot of people quitting during surf torture. They do this to you several times, especially in the beginning phases of SEAL training. But certainly during 1 or 2 of those times, you'll be in there and one of the instructors will drive a van up onto the beach and get out of the van with a megaphone and say, I have hot chocolate, blankets, and donuts for anybody who quits right now, right? And you get a lot of people quitting because it's a very tempting offer, right? And so I remember them doing this to us. We were in the surf and it was miserable. And the instructor said that. And I remember the guy next to me, he was on my right side. He yells back at the instructor. And he's like, "Hey, do you have any chocolate glazed donuts? Because if you don't, I'm not quitting." And he burst out laughing and I burst out laughing. And I remember I was like, this is not too bad. It felt better, right? But then I looked at the guy on my left, and the guy on my left wasn't laughing at all. He was I don't even think he heard the joke. He was lost in his pain. And I said to myself, "Oh boy, this guy's probably not going to make it." And sure enough, within about a minute, that guy quit. And so one of the things we have to recognize about laughing is an involuntary response. It's like sneezing, okay? And when we laugh, we automatically get juiced with three very powerful chemicals, okay? One is dopamine, and we all know dopamine, and anybody who's listened to Hubermann like you knows it's a very powerful reward chemical. It tells us this is good, keep doing this, okay? One of the most powerful ones we have. It's why it's the root of all addictive behavior, but it tells us this is good, keep doing this is good, right? We also get endorphins. Endorphins mask our pain. Now, as an ultra runner, let me back up. In the late 60s, early 70s, they were studying the brains of drug addicts, and the neuroscientists discovered that the human brain had opiate receptors. And they said, well, why the heck does the human brain have opiate receptors? It's because we make our own opiates. Endorphins are the human body's opiate. And so we are flooded with, and this is called runner's high. We are endurance creatures. And one of the things that makes us endurance creatures is if we're in an activity for a while, our body or in physical strain for a while, our body will begin to make endorphins to help us keep going, right? So it masks our pain. Then finally, there's oxytocin. Oxytocin, known as a love hormone. It's actually a neuromodulator. It affects both body and brain, but it's really the binding chemical of all human beings, right? You get huge amounts when you engage in physical contact with human beings. Acts of kindness and generosity will induce oxytocin. All this to say, when we laugh, we get juiced with these three powerful chemicals, whether we want it or not, we get them, right? And so think about what this happens. I'm in the surf zone. I'm miserable, getting surf tortured. The instructor makes his really Machiavellian offer, and my buddy cracks a joke, and we both laugh. Suddenly my body says, this is good, keep doing this. This doesn't feel that bad. We're in this together, right? All of us, when we think about some of the greatest teams we've been on, we think about the fact that humor has been a part. Humor is a hack into feeling better. It's how people bond and bind. And so it's an amazing part of every high-performing team. And again, I will say I've never, ever encountered a high-performing team that doesn't have humor in it. And when we talk about the attributes in the book, I talk about the chapter Honor the Class Clown. What that means is you don't have to necessarily be the person making the jokes, right? You just have to be able to laugh. There are always going to be on some teams, on any team that's working, there's going to be one or two people, and they're just the people who are always cracking the joke, sometimes at the wrong time, but it makes us laugh, right? They are very powerful members of our team, those class clowns. And so we have to really understand their position and their place in the organization. But that's how important humor is.
Yeah, definitely. And you just need those times to kind of cut through the pain, because at the end of the day, I always believe anyways that, like Ray Dalio said it a while ago, pain plus reflection equals progress. And like most times, if you really want to challenge yourself during periods of hardship and change, you literally have to deal with the pain as well. For me, a lot of it's driven through mindset. Looking at the attributes that you talk about, maybe it's a good opportunity to dive into the motivations behind the book. And also, we don't have to list and talk about each and every one, but the key ones that you believe today.
Yeah, well, let me just give the audience a quick definition of terms, right? And what I was doing when I kind of started thinking about the attributes was I wanted to deconstruct performance to ask ourselves, okay, what are we actually looking at when we're watching someone perform or assessing or hiring? And what I realized is that there's a difference between skills and attributes. Skills tell us that we know how to do the job, right? Attributes tell us we have the ability, we have the qualities that allow us to do the job, right? The difference is this: skills are not inherent to our nature, okay? In other words, none of us are born with the ability to ride a bike or throw a ball or drive a car, okay? We're trained to do those things. We're taught to do those things. Skills direct our behavior in known and specific environments. So here's how and when to throw a ball or ride a bike. And then they also are very easy to see so that you can measure them, you can test them, you can put scores around them. You can put statistics around skills. You can put them on resumes, which is why we get seduced by skills often when we're picking teams or hiring or performance evaluating, right? But skills don't tell us how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty. This is where attributes come in. Attributes, on the other hand, are inherent to our nature. In other words, All of us are born with levels of patience, adaptability, situational awareness. Now, we can certainly develop those over time and experience, but you can see levels of this stuff in very small children. Anybody who has kids or has experienced kids will agree with me when I say there are 1.5-year-olds who are patient and there are 1.5-year-olds who are impatient. So there's a nature-nurture element to attributes. Attributes don't direct our behavior. They inform our behavior. They tell us how we're going to show up to an environment. My son's levels of perseverance and resilience, for example, when it showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're hard to see, they're very difficult to assess and measure and test. Okay, so how do you assess someone's levels of adaptability or perseverance or things like that? But all we need to know is if we're ignoring attributes in the performance picture, we're ignoring a huge part, if not the most important part of the performance picture, because any high performer or high performing team is defined as such because they perform not only when things are going great, but they also perform when things aren't going great. And when things aren't going great is when these attributes come to the fore. So we need to understand these qualities about ourselves. When we think about the attributes, just for your audience's knowledge, we all have all of the attributes, okay? And now in the book, I talk about 25. We've increased that list now to 41 when we do work with companies, organizations, and the assessment you took is 41 attributes, but we all have all of them. The difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each. So if we take adaptability, if 7 is high and 1 is low, I'd be a level 6 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow, okay? Someone else might be a level 3, which means the same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow. They're still adaptable because all human beings are. It's just there's more friction there. So if we're kind of line up all these attributes on the wall like dimmer switches, all of us would have different dimmer switch settings, and that starts to speak to our own individual performance. And so the idea is, can we start lifting the hoods on our own performance and figure out where we fall on this stuff? Because that will define why and how we perform the way we do, not only in everyday life, but especially during stress, challenge, and uncertainty.
Do you think if you look at skills can be taught, but looking at attributes, do you think that attributes can be taught as well? Because the reason I asked this question is when I spoke to Dr. Laura Boyd about neuroplasticity and neuroscience, she believed that you can cultivate and nurture the brain that you want and ultimately change your behavioral traits. And I kind of believe that too, but ultimately a lot of that comes down to self-reflection and self-awareness. What are your views in respect to that?
So that's a great question. And I would say the way we can determine whether or not we're dealing with a skill or an attribute is to ask a very simple question. And that question is, can I teach it or can it be taught? If the answer is yes, it's probably a skill. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute. If you said, hey, Rich, I want to learn how to shoot a pistol and hit a bullseye, I could take you to the range and teach you how to do that within 3 hours. That's a skill. Or you could say, hey, Rich, I want to learn how to be more patient. I can't teach you how to do that. So I would say that attributes cannot be taught, but attributes can be developed. If you are low on an attribute and you want to develop it, there's 3 things that have to happen. First, you have to recognize that you're low on it. Okay, that's number 1. Second is you have to have a motivation, desire, or a need to develop it, right? Why do I say that? It's because just because you're low on an attribute doesn't mean you need to develop it. In fact, being low on it might be exactly what you need for the niche you're in. I always kind of joke that the comedian who has too much empathy is going to be a lousy comedian, okay? Because how can you find funny at a funeral if you have too much empathy, right? So just because you're low doesn't mean you have to. However, if you are low and you say, you know what, I do want to develop this, then the third one is the most important. That is, you have to go seek out and find environments that test and tease and develop that attribute. So if you want to develop your patience, for example, you have to go find environments that test and tease your patience, whatever that looks like for you subjectively. It could be, I'm going to go drive in traffic deliberately, or I'm going to pick the longest line in the grocery store. I always say have kids. Having kids will develop patience. But whatever that is, you can do that for any attribute. So I would say attributes cannot be taught. And by taught, I mean, when I think teaching, it's I'm imparting knowledge upon you that allows you to learn something. Okay, that's teaching, right? You can't do that with attributes. However, you can develop attributes, which means you can take initiative, kind of like you said, and look internally and start to self-guide and challenge yourself to actually develop and bring up an attribute you're low on.
Yeah, I guess for me personally, looking at people like your friend Andrew, for example, he talked on a podcast a while ago about the introject and the ability to shape your reality around the actions of others, but ultimately the ownership of that change lies upon you as the individual. Yeah. I believe strongly in that we are a reflection of the environments that we place ourselves within. Yeah, I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, so that's why I think these are nature-nurture, right? Because environment does matter. I was just talking to a friend, and she was telling me about her adopted son. She was remarking how there are so many different things about her son than her because the genetics aren't there, right? The way she is in many ways, her son is just not that way because he's adopted. The son has some genetically passed on attributes that she doesn't have or vice versa. That said, because she's had this environment where the son's been living now for so many years, he has developed attributes because of that environment. So environment does matter. Obviously, I would never argue with Andrew on neuroscience, and I'm not in this case. I'm completely agreeing. Environment does matter. If you put a cucumber in a pickle jar, it will pickle. So these attributes, and I would say, here's a great example. You could have a child, for example, who's just naturally lower on adaptability, okay? But that child could be part of a military family, and they're moving every couple years because the military family has to move every couple years. And because that child is switching schools every couple years and having to adapt to new environments, that child's adaptability develops. But it's also true that can also not happen. That child could move every couple of years, and it could still every couple of years, it's incredibly hard for them to adapt, and their adaptability stays low. So I think environment does matter. Environment can certainly develop attributes. They're more difficult and harder to move the needle on than just plain skills. And you can't be taught it. The environment can, another human can't teach it to you. The environment can help you develop it.
Yeah, you mentioned development. I guess what some actionable steps that people could take to enhance their own attributes, such as things like resilience, adaptability, courage, and I guess how did this work in practice in things like the Navy SEALs?
Yeah, so the Navy SEALs, it worked in practice because you always had environments inside of which you could develop. But let's just talk about the developmental process, and this is something Hubermann and I have talked about a lot, and that is, when you're developing anything, when you're developing a process or a skill or some sort of thing, right, your brain is creating neural connections, right? Neural networks are connecting. So you're creating connections. And then as you create that connection and you do it more and more, that pathway myelinates. So myelin begins to wrap that connection. And so once that pathway is fully myelinated, that means that the information travels without thinking. I mean, it's so fast. You've literally got to the point where you can do it without thinking. That's a fully myelinated neural pathway. What neuroscience has proven is that process of creating a neural connection and myelination can in fact increase by 10 to 50 to sometimes 100 times if there are three things present in the environment. Okay, those three things are intensity, novelty, and focus. Okay, if you have these three things present, you actually learn things way faster. Okay, this is the difference between being told a stove is hot or touching a hot stove. If you touch it, you'll never touch it again. This is also why we remember the alphabet song. It's also why when we go through challenging situations, we learn so viscerally because all three things are present: intensity, novelty, and focus. And so when we talk about this type of development, the more intensity, novelty, and focus you can have in an environment, the faster that development process will happen. I think this is why development in something like the SEAL teams is so pronounced, because everything about what Navy SEALs do, whether it's training or real world, has loads of intensity, novelty, and focus in it. All right. But we can do this ourselves. We can create environments like this, but we can also recognize environments around us that we're just in every day. They're like, oh, wait, that was different. Okay. And you can recognize that. So I think if people are able to recognize and focus on the fact that if these things are present, you'll enhance your ability to learn this stuff. We'll all learn and develop faster.
What about the role of individual mindsets? Because there's that common parallel between a growth and a fixed mindset. And in my view, I'm more enamored with the idea of knowledge and continuous growth. So this is probably one of the reasons why I've started a podcast and other bits and pieces that I get involved with. But I also think that there's a good interlink into fear. For me personally, anything that within reason, I guess, anything that my brain is telling me that I shouldn't do, more often than not, I want to do.
Yeah.
It's that challenge aspect. And I know that feeds into a lot of work of Hubermann as well in respect to the work that he does. But yeah, I'd just love to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, well, fear is an accelerant because fear is upping the ante. I mean, when you're afraid, you automatically have intensity, novelty, and focus. I mean, you're just seeding the environment with that. So I think, and Hubermann, I believe that he's talked about this in one of his many podcasts. Obviously, he has so much brilliance, it's hard to figure out which one. But mindset is linked because if you're closed-minded, if you can't be open to learning, then you are shutting down, to some extent, neuroplasticity, right? And again, I am not as verbose at all. And I mean, Andrew would be able to tell us exactly what's happening in the brain. But I would say this idea that this open-mindedness, this curiosity that allows you to say, okay, but it also allows you to actually interrogate situations So I'll give you the layman's version of this. When we have open-mindedness, when we have a growth mindset, it allows you to ask questions about environments in a different way. Our brains are question answering machines. That's how our brain interrogates the world all the time. And it's usually unconscious, but we're asking questions about our environment all the time. This also happens on a conscious level in terms of if we put a question into our frontal lobe, then our brain has no choice but to begin to come up with answers. And I do this experiment with people. I just say, hey, I give them a random question and say, hey, take 30 seconds, just write down as many things that pop into your head. And they end up with lists of like 4 or 5 things. And it's because anytime you put a question in your brain begins to answer it. A lot of us do this the wrong way. We say things like, why am I so bad at this? Or why does this always happen to me? We are going to get some fantastic answers as to why we're so bad at this if we ask ourselves that question. I think the growth mindset is really, in essence, the ability to ask better questions and reframe the questions. The growth mindset allows us to say, okay, what did I learn from that? What could I do better, right? And you change the angle of your introspection, and therefore you get better answers, and therefore you learn more. And so I think the growth mindset is the ability and the willingness to look back at a situation or even during a situation and say, oh, okay, this is painful. What am I learning here? It changes the quality of answers you get, whether it's in the moment or past the moments. I think it's all about asking better questions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's a challenge in itself, because often when you're in the moment, you can be frustrated and annoyed with circumstances. But then if you're able to take yourself out of situations and reflect upon the moment, and rather than look and self-critique as to why does this always happen to me, what have I learned from this situation, is more impactful. And yeah, ultimately it's how you talk to yourself as well, how you talk to others.
Well, I would say emotion is interesting because emotion is, we can harness the emotion is fuel, right? And regardless of what emotion it is, it's fuel. But emotion also can, because it's more of a limbic function, it can sometimes take us out of that conscious thinking realm to a degree that we don't necessarily want. Part of the process of being able to get that frontal lobe back online is to, in a moment when it might be more difficult, is to ask ourselves, okay, what am I feeling right now and why? Because as soon as you ask that question, you're bringing your frontal lobe back online. You're re-engaging your frontal lobe in a manner that will allow you to actually take further logical steps. So it's kind of the whole name it to tame it type thing. Use emotion as fuel, yes, but we can't let our emotions get us to a place where we're acting without thinking. And so one of the ways we can do that is by simply asking, all right, what am I feeling right now? And identifying it and why. And you're neuroscientifically taking control. You're taking control back from your limbic, and you're actually allowing yourself into a conscious frontal lobe question state, which is really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. I've got to say as well, one of the things I really enjoyed in advance of jumping on the call with you today was also the assessment that you kindly shared. To anybody listening or watching, I'll put a link in the comment for a discount code that you've also kindly applied. Yeah, that assessment in itself, I found really intriguing. I don't know if you've got the results of what I had, because, yeah, it'd be good to walk through some of them, because, yeah, I was quite shocked with some of the results. But, yeah, it was really interesting as well.
Well, good. I know we have a little bit of time left here, but when you looked at your results, what I'll ask you is, wasn't there surprising in your top 5, bottom 5?
Not really. Like, obviously, the vision aspect, most people that come into contact with me, I'm obsessed by the future. I'm obsessed by change.
Yeah.
And transformation, be it both personally and professionally. So I knew that one would be up there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's also that fine balance between, I wouldn't say I'm narcissistic, but the level of narcissism, that the low level on there, I thought would be a little bit higher.
A little bit higher. I'm looking at your top 5 now. And so your top 5 are creativity, curiosity, open-mindedness, perseverance, and decisiveness, which is really cool, because what that says is you're someone who's not only looking for new knowledge, but you're also open-minded to new experiences and things. Highly creative, which means your mind's everywhere. That speaks to you. Also, your bottom 5 was patience, narcissism, persistence, extroversion, and humor. So when you talk about lower narcissism, I agree with you. I find myself a little bit higher sometimes, but what this is saying is your curiosity and open-mindedness allows for you to often be like, hey, listen, I actually don't need to stand out. I just want to learn. I think those 2 high attributes tamp down your narcissism, because you'd rather learn and grow than stand out. If you have to be a fly on the wall, but you're learning, you're happy with that, right? So I think it tamps down your narcissism. I think what's interesting is you're high on decisiveness, which means you make decisions fairly rapidly and efficiently. You're also low on patience, which those obviously mesh. All right, that's actually a really good quality to have, although I'll just give you a blind spot. So part of understanding these attributes is also to understand our possible blind spots. When you're high on decisive and low on patience. One of your blind spots is you may make decisions too rapidly. There may be times where you're like, oh, shoot, I actually need to slow down and pull back. You're going to do it really fast. So you just got to be careful of making a decision too fast because of your impatience. What's interesting is your extroversion is low. All that means is that you're just someone who gains more energy from smaller groups, sometimes by yourself. When you're in large groups, your battery's draining. I'm like you. In other words, you and I, if you and I go to a cocktail party together and there are 80 people, it has nothing to do with our ability to be social, right? We can still be social for 2 or 3 hours, but during that time, our batteries are draining, which means at the end of that, all we want to do is just get out of there and go to bed. We just want to, whereas the extrovert, they go into that environment after 3 hours, they're just buzzing, right? That's all that means. Introversion, extroversion has nothing to do with our ability to be social. So there's a couple of interesting nuances here and how they kind of intertwine. The other thing I'll say for you as you kind of go through your results later, and then if people do take the assessment, it's not necessarily about the scores, it's about how they rank out, okay? Your top to your number 1 down to the 41, it's just how you prioritize attributes as your raw self. And again, just because you're low on one, like you're low on patience, it doesn't mean you can't work on your patience, right? It doesn't mean you can't work on your extroversion. Although you just have to ask yourself, do I need to, right? I mean, I can put something like my wife I'm high on patience. My wife is low on patience. That works beautifully for us because when patience is required, I step up. When impatience is required, she steps up. I'm more introverted. She's more extroverted, right? So when we go to events together, it's perfect when she's with me because she can help pull me around and drive me to be more social. But at the end of those things, I just have to go to bed where she has trouble going to sleep, right? So, but you can team up with people that allow you to kind of mesh these things. So again, the idea is look at this. There's zero judgment. It's really just about how your engine runs. And it becomes really cool to kind of look into.
And that's what balances a really high performing team, that kind of variety within people's attributes and skill sets. And when I read the book, I was enamored by the conversation about the workplace scenario of ultimately aligning a really high skilled team, but ultimately attributes were a bit off tilt. And the way that I looked at it, obviously we've just finished the Euros in Europe at the moment. And like England, if you look on paper, a really high skilled team, but there was a misbalance in the attributes potentially.
Well, that's the thing. I call it in the book, I call it the dream team paradox. A lot of people build teams and they think, oh, I'm just going to get the best people, the best marketer, the best graphics designer, the best this, best that. And they put them all together and say, hey, we have the team of the rock stars, right? But a lot of times those rock stars, if you haven't focused on how those rock stars interact, what will happen is that team will do great when things are going great. But as soon as things go sideways, that team will turn toxic, right? And this is when we have to start thinking about attributes. Attributes allow us to understand things about people that allow us to mesh and interact together. So you can literally put together a much higher performing team, oftentimes, if you don't necessarily focus on skills and you focus on attributes. The team of rock stars, they just fall apart when things fall apart. But the down and out team, it doesn't seem like they're the top team. When the what hits the fan, they mesh together and they perform beautifully. You can figure that out with attributes first.
Yeah, definitely. I could talk to you all day, to be honest, but I'm conscious of time. I'd love to touch upon maybe key thoughts and takeaways that you'd like to leave with our audience.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love for the audience just to get curious, get some of your curiosity on what their performance picture is. I am fascinated. I've always been fascinated since I was a Navy SEAL and since I made it through SEAL training about who we are at our most raw, our elemental selves, right? And in other words, when the what hits the fan, when things are really going sideways, who shows up? Who is that person? I was given the gift of figuring that out fairly rapidly in SEAL training. And of course, throughout my SEAL career, I just knew it. I knew it about myself. I knew about my teammates. And I recognized that was a real gift, as a superpower. So part of my goal in the attributes work and the things we do is to help people figure that out about themselves. And so I'd encourage them to start thinking about what that is. Our attributes are at the elemental part of our performance. It's different than personality, all right? Personality is great. And all the personality tests out there, there are a lot of really good ones, but they really only tell us how we are and who we are in normal environments, okay? Because when the things get really, really tough, personality often goes out the window. We're running on these attributes. And so I would encourage people to just start thinking about what their performance picture is. And they can look at the book, they can take the assessment if they like. I know we're going to give a discount code, but start having that conversation for themselves, but also if they are in teams, this is how the highest performing teams do it. We focus on these qualities, right? Skills are important, yes. We have to know certain things, but I'd rather get someone who has the attributes because in most cases, I can always train the skill if they have the attributes. And so that's what I would offer.
Rich, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure that we're going to chat again. But if people want to reach out and get in contact with you, how best can they do that? And also, in respect to the assessment, where do we direct people to?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, theattributes.com, and it's all there to include the assessment. I know I know we're going to have a discount code for your audience. If they go and they take the assessment, they'll get a discount. But theattributes.com is where to find everything we do, our assessments, all of our workshops, any of the consulting we do. And the book is there too, but the book is on Amazon. It's easy to find as well. So those are the places. And of course, I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn and all social media stuff too. So you can check me out there.
Amazing. Honestly, I knew this was going to be class. So thank you so much for your time. And it's been an absolute pleasure.
Pete, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure for me as well. So thanks.